I'm going to show you the third round game from Norway chess between Magnus Carlsen, world champion, and Levon Aronian, and you're in for a treat here. Carlsen with the white pieces opens with e4. Aronian, as usual, plays e5, and no gioco piano today, or no bishop's opening either, a Spanish. Now, Aronian has two main systems when playing against the Spanish: the Marshall or the Berlin. Well, today he goes for the Berlin. Super solid. I know not everyone's favourite variation. However, I've always been of the opinion it's not the variation that is particularly drawish. It's more the attitude of the players going into the opening. And here, Carlsen did not go for the endgame, which arises after d4. And that can be very hard work to win. But instead he goes for rook e1, which leaves a virtually symmetrical pawn structure, but there's no doubt that white has a little bit more freedom in these lines. You can see that straight away. Black has the temporary problem of the knight on d6, and this really needs to move so that the d pawn can move and let out the bishop on c8. But there are simple ways of doing this, and this is how it's done. The knight moves to f5, making way for the d pawn. Now, the most popular move here is c3, but there are very reliable methods of equalizing after d5. Still slightly better for white. White's piece is a better place. This bishop hits the pawn here, so white has more activity, and the knight is slightly misplaced on f5, but still, black should equalize that one, and good methods have been found. But instead of c3, Carlsen played d5, and he said after the game my approach was like the first round. I didn't aim for too much, but it's a very safe way to play. So typical Carlsen, he's not looking to blow away his opponents from the opening, but just keep the ball in play, basically. So d5 gives white some space, but of course does grant the bishop more freedom. But this knight on f5 is still a bit of a problem for black, because at some moment black is going to have to play d6, but then the knight doesn't seem so well placed as it blocks the bishop, and it needs to find a better square. Anyway, more on that in a second. Aronian played rook e8. d6 is the other move there. And Aronian had exactly this position against Caruana in the recent Grenka Classic. And there Caruana played bishop d3, and the game went into an endgame very quickly. And Caruana tried sacking a pawn with d6, but didn't get really anywhere at all. But Carlsen obviously had a little idea up his sleeve. In this position, well, knight d2 has previously been played before, but Carlsen came out with queen d3, and that looks a little bit unusual. So it seems to me that Carlsen has this bank of quirky little opening ideas, and he just thinks, okay, which one am I going to play today? So he's been obviously storing this one up, and queen d3 on the board. So what's the big idea? It looks very odd to sort of block this bishop. So first of all, you're attacking the knight, so that gets defended. And now we can see the idea. The knight comes to d2. Now, instead of having the queen on d1 with the queen on d3, it covers the e4 square, so the knight can, under the right circumstances, move to e4 and hassle the bishop, and then this bishop will come out and the rook to e1. So he's trying to exploit the fact that just for a moment black's development with the queen on e8 and this slightly oddly placed knight on f5 is not so good. The pieces tread on each other's toes a little bit. I should mention, if the queen comes down to e1, actually it can't really do very much on its own at all. c3 is a good move, followed by knight e4 and then rook b1, and the queen is in danger of being trapped. So coming back to this position. Well, already I think this is quite an important moment in the game actually, because Aronian has a fundamental decision here. Do you just continue developing and then you're slightly worse and you're fighting against white's space advantage, or do you try and break free with c6? Now, when you play c6, that could involve a slight weakening of your pawn structure. So, for example, after c3, and then you take, white recaptures. So black has this isolated pawn. And you can either take or maybe come back here. White is slightly better, very slightly better. But black's pieces are active enough. White can also, after c6, go for c4 as well and try to hold this space advantage. But in that case, black's bishop looks pretty good here. So c6 is a very possible in this position. But instead, Aronian decided to keep his pawn structure intact and just to trade pieces. So bishop g5. So the knight moves, came to f3. So bishops traded. But this is pleasant for white because suddenly his development is absolutely clear. Rook is about to come into play, as happened here, and now rook e1. And this is a bit uncomfortable for black. So which way does the queen go? We would like to play queen f8 in order to bring the rook in the corner into play. But then white's queen starts to hassle the pawns on the queen side. So for example, like this, queen c3, hitting this one, and black simply doesn't have time to swing the rook over to the e-file because he's been kept busy trying to guard these pawns on the queen side. So after rook e1, Aronian played queen d8. And I think now we can see that this is really pleasant because this rook is on the open file and can't be challenged for the moment. And white can use this space that was created by the advance of this pawn to maneuver very freely. As Carlsen said afterwards, in a position with more space, it's easier to find good moves. So typical Carlsen, he just wants a position where his moves are easier to play than his opponent's, and he certainly has that here. So a very successful opening experiment. Well, once again, black has this decision. Do you try and get some freedom by advancing the c-pawn? If c5, then the queen will switch to f4 and d6 is weak, so that doesn't look good. c6 looks better. Nevertheless, in this position, white has a pleasant position. You could simply take on d5 here, and I mean, this is certainly a much better version than the position we looked at earlier with c6. The knight still isn't well placed, and these pawns, well, in fact, you know, all these pawns are potential targets, and the rook, well, all white's pieces stand extremely well in this position. So I can understand why Aronian didn't want to go for it there. Instead, he played g6, so giving the king an escape square, fine, but also creating a few weaknesses. Also, he wants to give the knight square. Once again, c6 is possible, and bishop d3, and now queen f4 is an interesting move. Looking at the pawn on d6, sometimes if that knight moves, then you might be able to go into h6. So black is really under pressure here. Aronian put the knight back on g7, and now rook e3. That's an interesting idea. So once again, using this space very creatively, the rook may swing across to the queen side. You never know, it might swing to the king side. once again, c6 is possible, but I think it's clear to see that white, in this case, has just a big positional advantage. Just white's pieces are so much better, plus better pawn structure. Aronian played a5. Now, if he can advance one more space and at some point maybe play rook a5, that's good, but of course Carlsen clamps that one. Now knight e8. Well, this looks truly miserable, particularly after this move, next move, queen d4. Aronian would like to play queen f6 to bring the queen into play, but queen d4, of course, prevents that, because after this, rook takes and queen takes queen. Thank you very much. After queen d4, Aronian played the knight back to g7, so he's going back and forth, and this really doesn't look right. Sure sign that things have gone badly wrong, and g4 prevents knight f5. After the game, well, Carlsen thought that Aronian had underestimated this move g4. It looks very natural just to take away the square from the knight and the bishop. And now things look really desperate. Now there's no need to take on c6. Carlsen simply kept the pawn on d5 because that really cramps the bishop and knight. Knight came back to e8. I mean, it looks appalling, and well, I think things have really gone downhill now. Queen f4, looking at the d6 pawn, also looking at potentially queen h6, and don't forget there could be some threats to f7 as well. So for example, c takes d5, knight g5 is actually very promising for white. King g7 played, and now here's a nice move. I think this demonstrates that Carlsen is in total control of this position. Rook b3 attacks the b7 pawn, and just reminds black that there's another weakness there on the queen side. The rook came to b8. Sometimes, if white ever breaks through on d6, then the rook will be en prise there. So it's a very difficult decision, even after this move rook b3, to know how to defend that b pawn. Knight g5 played, and now queen f6 was probably the last chance that Aronian had. In that case, the queen would drop to d2 and the knight would go to e4, hitting the queen. And check. And this is so much fun for white to play. Now the rook swings back to attack the queen. It's a miserable position, but black is still on the board. After knight f6, it really is lost. After rook f3, the rook's swinging back, and the pressure is just too much here. For example, after queen e7, rook attacks the queen. Queen goes back. Queen d4, and this pin is absolutely fatal. There's going to be no defense to this. So for example here, and rook f3. I mean, there are other ways that black can play that. Shows the basic idea though. So rook f3 just played in the game, and Aronian answered with h6. Knight e4 is a winning move. That has to be taken, but check. And queen g6. And that was the final move of the game. Aronian resigned. He was also running very, very short of time, I should say. Position's completely lost. Queen takes knight threatened. Rook f7 threatened. Queen h6 threatened. If queen g5, then white is simply 2 pawns up. If knight g5, we take check, and rook f6, followed by taking here or rook g6. It is completely over. An absolutely crushing victory for the world champion. He said after the game, he was asked, you know, what do you think of your start? He said, now that everything's going so well, it's just a joy. So he's really having a good time in Norway chess, and he leads the tournament. He's the only player that has scored victories so far. He has 2.5 out of 3, and yeah, tremendous. You know, a few years ago, Aronian was really billed to be the next potential challenger for Carlsen, but his star is falling a little bit. Obviously, very disappointing performance in the candidates. And his record against Carlsen recently isn't too good. They did draw in the Grenke Chess Classic, but for example, in the London Chess Classic, Magnus managed to beat him, and Magnus also defeated him in last summer's Sinkfield Cup. So Aronian struggling at the moment, poor guy. If you want to see that game from the London Chess Classic, then do look in the video description, and you'll find the link to that game, and also playlists from Carlsen and Aronian. Thanks very much for watching. Tomorrow is a rest day in Norway, but I'll be back for rounds 4 and so on. Thanks for watching.